Hi, I'm Father Rick Morley, Rector of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Basking Ridge, New Jersey, and this is With Us, a course on the Tabernacle in the wilderness, the Temple in Jerusalem, and the presence of God with us. This is Session 4, where we'll explore the history of the transition from Tabernacle to Temple, and where we'll begin to look at the construction of the temple itself. As we've seen, the tabernacle was the mobile worship center for the ancient Israelites as they spent their 40 years in the wilderness between their enslavement in Egypt and their arrival into a land that had been promised them. Once they came into their new land, the tabernacle just sort of stopped being set up. It's unclear what happened to it and to the other pieces of furniture, but the Ark of the Covenant was placed in a shrine in Shiloh. At least some priests dedicated their lives to attending to the Ark there, but that seems to be about it. During this time, Israel was a mere collection of tribes. There was no central governmental structure and very little coordination between the tribes. Each of the 12 tribes just sort of tended to their own needs until a crisis would arise, usually in the form of a foreign enemy who had come to make trouble. Then the 12 tribes would join together under the banner of a centralized leader called a judge. The judges were called by God to their various tasks, and then once the crisis had been dealt with, they went back to their day jobs, and the tribes went back to their tribal living. These leaders appear to be called by God because of their strength, their cunning, their faithfulness, and their leadership abilities. Some of the more famous judges were Samson, Gideon, and Deborah. Because there were 12 tribes spread out and rarely interacting with each other, there was also no single place that they held in common. No capital, no palace, no place of focus and unity. This was unique in the ancient Near East at this time. All of the other nations had capital cities and were ruled over by kings and queens. All other nations had grand cultic centers where their religious lives were lived out. The Israelites eventually got jealous of all the royal hubbub, sort of like how we Americans always swoon over the British royal family. So, after a lot of hand-wringing, the Israelites sought out a king to unite them. Samuel and Saul were sort of two transitional figures who, in their own tragic stories, sought to unite the nation at great personal cost. But then David, the youngest son of Jesse, was called to be king. He was anointed as king of Israel, uniting the 12 tribes together into one nation. Like any king that's worth his salt, he needed a centralized place to govern from, and so David established a capital city in Jerusalem. Now, Israel had a proper centralized government, a proper centralized capital, and eventually a proper place to house the king. The only thing that they were missing was a centralized place to worship. David lamented that while he lived in a house, the Ark of the Covenant was still in a tent in Shiloh. So, with a grand display of artistry, pageantry, and passion, David brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. It is said that David danced with all his might as the Ark came into the capital. David wanted to build God a temple, but that task would eventually fall to his son, Solomon. Solomon built a temple in Jerusalem based on the basic design of the tabernacle in the wilderness. There was an outer court for all of Israel, which contained a huge altar with a massive grill upon it to burn the meat from the sacrifices. The ramp going up to this altar was 60 feet long. There was also a large basin in the outer courtyard, a bronze basin that was sat up on the backs of 12 bronze bulls. There were also smaller bronze basins set around the courtyard for the purpose of priestly cleansing before and after sacrifices. With a larger altar and more bronze basins, the temple was obviously set up to be not only more permanent than the tabernacle in the wilderness, but to accommodate more sacrificing. This nation is growing, and so more sacrifices were going to be needed. Inside the temple proper, there were, again, 2 rooms. A larger room, an outer sanctum in which there was an altar of incense, tables for the bread of presence, and multiple menorahs. This room was covered in gold from top to bottom. The inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, was a cube, just like in the tabernacle, and it was empty, save for the Ark of the Covenant. It also was covered in gold. And this room was, of course, completely restricted, except for the high priest, who would enter once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. In the 580s BC, Israel came into some trouble. They were a vassal state of the nation of Babylon, meaning that they depended on the Babylonians for protection, for which they paid a handsome sum. In theory, they were paying the Babylonians to protect them from other nations, but in reality, they were paying Babylon to keep Babylon from destroying them. You know how you sometimes sit down with your finances and you go over your bills and you think, do I really need to be paying for this Netflix subscription? I have cable and Amazon Prime, and between those, maybe I could do without Netflix. Well, Israel sat down and looked at its bills and said, do we really need to keep paying Babylon? I mean, if we stopped paying them, what's the worst that could happen? You know, they're a busy nation. They're not going to have time to come and destroy us. So they rolled the dice and they stopped making their payments. And then in 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, rolled his army up to the gates of Jerusalem and laid siege to the city. The fortified walls held Babylon at bay for months, but then they finally broke through. They killed the people of Israel indiscriminately. They killed men, women, children, the elderly in the streets. They tore down the protective walls of the city. They took survivors back to Babylon to serve as their slaves. And they tore the temple down, stone by stone. They utterly destroyed it. One of the interesting things about this is we don't know what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. In this whole scene of the destruction of the temple, there is no mention of the Ark whatsoever. In fact, in the biblical history, if you read backwards from the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, you'll find that the Ark hadn't been mentioned in a long, long time. What happened to it? Well, that's a mystery. Maybe best left to the likes of Indiana Jones. But it appears that the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum, had been utterly empty for years, decades, maybe even a century or more. We don't know. Though, technically, it wasn't completely empty, because the Holy of Holies was still the place where the presence of God dwelt, just no longer on the ark. But God was there nonetheless. The survivors who had been taken to Babylon as slaves were there for 70 years. Think about that. The generation that had been hauled out of Jerusalem died off, and a new generation arose on foreign soil. This new generation had only heard tales of what Jerusalem had been like, what its streets looked like, what its temple was all about. The Babylonians were eventually conquered by the Persians, whose king was Cyrus. Cyrus, who had just come into possession of Babylon's captive Israelites, determined that he had no use for them and that they were welcome to go back home. Cyrus was gracious enough to give the Israelites some money and some other resources to rebuild their nation, their city, their walls, and their temple. In Isaiah 45, Cyrus is called God's anointed, or more literally translated, God's Messiah. Quite astonishingly, this pagan king was given the highest title Israel had to offer, because in at least some sense, he had saved them. Once back in their homeland, a homeland that the vast majority of them had never set foot in before, the Israelites got to work rebuilding. Under the direction of leaders like Nehemiah and Ezra, they rebuilt the temple. This second temple wasn't as large and certainly wasn't as grand. It was a simple temple, a starter temple. After 70 years in slavery, they just didn't have the resources amassed to cover the place in gold and finery, and Cyrus only gave them so much to work with. But they consecrated this temple, rededicated themselves to God, and the temple sacrificial system was back on track. Once again, God's people were in their own land, and God was dwelling in their midst once more. Over the centuries, the temple would go through various improvements and expansions and additions to its beauty and resources. The temple would also know troubles. In 180 BC, the Temple Mount was seized by the Greek Seleucids. They set up an idol to Zeus in the Holy of Holies, and they started sacrificing pigs, an unclean animal, to the Jews on the altar. A group of Jewish mercenaries led by Judas Maccabeus drove the Greeks out, cleaned the temple, and rededicated it. When they went to relight the menorahs, they only had enough sacred oil for one day, but miraculously the lamps burned for 7 days. Thus, the holiday of Hanukkah, the festival of the rededication, was born. In 20 BC, King Herod, an otherwise terrible human being, began a massive rebuilding of the temple. If there is one thing that Herod was good at, it was building. Many of the structures that he built still exist today. His expansion and beautification efforts of the Temple of Jerusalem raised its prominence to the point where contemporaries said that it would rival any temple in the world at the time with its splendor. Herod completed his construction and rededicated the temple around 10 BC. Unfortunately, it would last less than a century. In 70 AD, after decades of tensions with the Roman Empire, the Romans destroyed the temple. They removed every stone that sat upon another stone. Then they came back later and lowered the Temple Mount by nearly 20 feet. I mean, they ground it to the ground. Everything was gone except a small portion of a small retaining wall that was part of the outer courts of the temple complex that we know today as the Western Wall. At this point, archaeologists can't even figure out where the temple once actually stood. The Temple Mount itself is currently under control of Muslims. There's a large mosque there called the Al-Aqsa Mosque and a shrine called the Dome of the Rock. Contrary to popular opinion, the Dome of the Rock is not a mosque. It is literally a shrine built up over a rock outcrop. According to Islamic tradition, this rock is the place where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven from. and thus the last place that his feet touched the earth. According to Jewish tradition, this rock is the navel of the earth. It is traditionally the site where Abraham met God, the place where Isaac was nearly sacrificed, and the place where the Holy of Holies was, the very place that the Ark of the Covenant sat. In some corners of Jewish tradition, this rock is even seen as the very first part of the earth that was formed in the beginning of creation, quite literally, the earth's navel. There is, however, some newer archaeological discoveries that point to a rather interesting possibility that the place we call today the Temple Mount wasn't actually where the temple stood. There is some evidence that it was actually built in another part of Jerusalem called the City of David. But that's conjecture that goes beyond the scope of this course. For our purposes, the temple stood in Jerusalem for centuries, even the better part of a millennium. And for the last 2 millennia, there has been no temple. So here are some questions for you to ponder and discuss. After hearing about the temple, does anything surprise you? Was anything in this session familiar? And if the temple was rebuilt today, how would that change the world as we know it?